Welcome to Unit 7 about layouting, which I call Arrange with Care. So layout is important in the scientific context, obviously, when making posters. And many institutions actually have a poster template that is readily available for usage by PhD students. And that already complies with the major layouting rules. Layout is, however, also important for multi-panel figures. So if we basically compose a figure with part A, part B, part C, all the way to E or whatever, it also is important that we make sure the layout is concise and readable. And then there is the layout of individual figures where we need to be attentive to where we place the header, which we already discussed in the unit about text, and where we place the legend. And as a reminder, the title is most easily accessible when we place it to the upper leftmost corner, while things like the legend can happily linger around in the lower right corner. So before, the first thing that you need to be attentive with when starting to lay out is the reading direction. The reading direction basically helps your audience to orient. So the best practice, which is for example done by journals and newspaper, is that you often start at the top left corner, then you go down and the next part goes up again, and then you go down again. The second best practice is basically how we read text. We start in the upper leftmost corner, the second part comes to the right of it, then we go to the below corner and start the next row. Basically, this is a columnar layout and this is a row layout. What is never really a good idea is to mix the two. So to basically start out with a row layout and then enter into a column layout. This is most of the times quite confusing and works only really well if you have a design experience maybe. The reading direction is also sometimes critical because the decision early on may save you some space. So here is the hierarchical relationship diagram, if you want, which explains the protocol of a clinical trial. So you screen the patients, then you decide whether they're eligible, etc., etc., and then you'd go to the trial arm. A layout in a vertical orientation like this, which is a column, requires a lot of space. And sometimes if we place it into a text of, for example, a grant application or something like this, we might not have so much space. So if you basically calculate, the layout like this will occupy many lines when placed in alongside a text file. You can do usually the same kind of layout, the same kind of information you can put into a horizontal layout, and I did a redesign here for a trial that we started at the medical faculty, where basically we have the exact same information, but now we have the time of the trial go from left to right, and this ends up saving a lot of space because we had to put it into a maximum 10-page grant application. And the layout like this needed a lot less lines than the upper layout. So sometimes deciding on a reading direction helps you with organizing the space in your visualization. The next thing that is really critical and that really helps you to enforce the columnar or the row layout in your visualization is called white space. White space is always your magic tool. You know that from museum settings where a piece of art is never displayed on the entire wall, but in order for you to appreciate it, all art pieces usually have a white rim around them, which sort of allows you to see the picture in a white frame and gives you the calmness to see at the center. That's what we call white space. Now let's have a look how we can use white space to make layouting easier. We now will talk about layouting on a grid. So basically, whenever you start with a poster or a figure, a multi-panel figure or anything like this, it's really good practice to start with pieces of paper. I like these yellow pieces of paper. I can write something on them and pin them somewhere. And if I don't like the design, I trash them. So when we want to start layouting and we decide on a row layout or a column layout, we basically should always think of the layout as a grid. Which means if we have, for example, 4 items and we want to use a row layout, then what we make sure is that the 2 pieces are very close to each other, while the information in the next rows has a much larger white space. In contrast, if we decide on a columnar layout, then we make sure that the white space between the 2 items within a column is less than across a column. So this white space or yellow space is larger than the space within the column. And that allows your audience to quickly grasp whether you are trying to show information in a row or a column layout. And if you have more items than 4, obviously you can create rows with more items or columns with more items or more columns, etc. Okay? But the most critical information is that you do not violate the grid that is underlying it. So you never should try things like this, to basically have a grid layout that is violated now by the blue box below. So you cannot draw a single line across anymore. Here you can, but here you cannot, and here you cannot. So this is basically a violation of the grid, and it's not very helpful to orient your readers. So it's always interesting to think of how our visual system perceives information, because that can guide our layout. And this was done in the 1920s already, and people figured out what we still call the Gestalt principles, the practice of good form. So the researchers were interested to understand what captures our attention first. What do we see first? So we already did the exercise that I always ask you, what do you see first? So you are already starting to train this in the last couple of exercises already. So the Gestalt principles are based on the following. So what we see here is a random blue shape, which starts somewhere. It has a cut-out white space in between. It's sort of round here. It has 2 edges here, and it's a rectangular form here, and this is sort of like a circle. Some people may say that what they see actually is a duck that is facing this direction. This is the eye of the duck, and this is the mouth part. Other people actually see a rabbit. So this is the eye of the rabbit, this is the little mouth part of the rabbit, and these are the 2 little ears. Now that I said the duck first, probably most of you will have seen the duck first. The interesting thing is that our brain is sort of slow. Once we saw the duck, we cannot unsee it, and it's very, very hard to focus on the rabbit. And in the second that we are no longer attentive, we see the duck again. So our brain has a sort of slowness to it that whatever we see as the first form will sort of stay. And probably none of you would describe this as a round shape with 2 edges and a rectangle. So we always try to see in images some simple form that we are already familiar with, which is why if we look into the clouds, we see animals and shapes and faces rather than random shapes. So there are a couple of Gestalt principles. So they formulated actually a large number of Gestalt principles, such as similarity, connectivity, proximity, simple form, symmetry, and continuity. There are many more, but these are the ones that are really good for knowing a little bit about when designing visualizations in the scientific context. So let's try them out. This is a random number. These are random letters that are spread across the page. Or do they actually have a meaning? It's a bit hard to tell at first glance. However, the Gestalt principle of similarity can help. Because if we make the letters similar to each other, for example, by using color, you all of a sudden see which letters belong together in order to form words. And now it's much easier to read that this is not simple to read. The same principle of similarity also helps, for example, in scatter plots. If we have scatter plots with a lot of dots, we can use color to create a group within the dots. For example, the control is shown in gray and the experiment is shown in blue. Or men are shown in blue and women are shown in gray, something like this. So we can color code groups of data points in our visualizations. And this can be done by color, but it can also be done, for example, by shape. Shape is a little bit harder usually to see than color, because the shapes are unequal in size and unequal in area size, which you already know contains quantitative information. If we go back to our sentence, then the next Gestalt principle, that of connectivity, can also be very, very helpful to orient our readers within our visualizations. So how does it work? Connectivity basically means I create connections, for example, by boxes. By boxing the letters into shaped rectangles, I force your brain to see them as belonging together, despite the fact that they are still very far from each other and would otherwise not be visible as a word. The same principle of connectivity also helps again in visualizations. So here we see a number of dots along the line. Some are closer together and some are less close together. By the principle of proximity, we would see, for example, the dots that are close together as belonging together, while the dots that are further from each other, that have a larger white space, do not belong together. However, by using connectivity Gestalt principle, I can force your eye to seeing them in groups of two. And now, despite the fact that these two guys are closer to each other than these two, we see them as being one unit because they're within a little box. And the same also works, for example, in charts. You can, for example, within a line chart, as it's done here, indicate a certain kind of treatment and thereby indicate that the data along this side belongs together because it was after an event in the experiment. The next Gestalt, so it's also important that Gestalt principles have a hierarchy. So connectivity always trumps similarity. So now we created similarity in the letters. So E, S, L, S, N are all of the same color. However, the connectivity is around the true words, which your brain sees way before it sees the color. So now, even though the colors, the letters have not a similar color, we still see them as belonging together because of the Gestalt principle of connectivity. And then the most important one is grouping and proximity. So here is again the sentence, which is not really simple to read, except now that you've seen it a couple of times, it becomes quite easy. However, if to this sentence we now apply the Gestalt principle of proximity or grouping, this becomes really simple. And the grouping is obviously also what we do when we when we arrange things into rows and into columns. we group these two items belonging together, and we group these two belonging together, and we create with white space enough of a distance to make sure our audience sees them as belonging together and them. Okay, so knowing a little bit about Gestalt principles can help you to design better figures. One more Gestalt principle that is good to know about is that of the simple form and symmetry. So now we can no longer show that with the letters. We switch to an actual visualization, now a chart. So here we have a bar chart with some random title, percentages, and not very nicely arranged numbers. And the bars are sort of scattered all over and not arranged by its size. So what we always appreciate as an audience is the order and symmetry. So if we now, for example, arrange the data according to the quantity, the percentage, and have it in an ordered manner displayed, people usually can see the data better and can much quicker say which one is the smallest bar in this whole range of bars. So they can see information quicker if it's symmetrically arranged. And if you now go to make arrangement of several panels in one figure, try to think of symmetry and simple form as well, and try to balance visualizations in a multi-panel figure as well, with considering symmetry and simple form. The next Gestalt principle is that of continuity. So this is very interesting and very dangerous, because what our eyes always does is that if it sees two lines that are not actually connected, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little lines. They are sort of arranged around a circular form, and what your brain does invariably, whether you want it or not, is that it forms basically a circle around the content inside. This is sometimes really useful. For example, if you need to point out details, for example, in an image, such as here, you can use a dashed circle to surround a structure that you want people to be seeing as belonging together. However, this also works in charts. For example, in this case that we saw before, in the misleading data section, we have a line chart where data is missing in the center. If you create a dashed line, you basically suggest to your audience that you think it continues to grow steadily throughout all the months. And if that is true, that is of course a beautiful way of illustrating this. However, if the data goes up and down a lot in between, then a dashed line would be really misleading to your audience. So remember that every time you have a dashed line, the eyes of your audience will always create complete shapes out of it. So this brings me to the summary of layouting. So when you decide on layout, whether it's a poster or a multi-panel figure, decide whether you would want to have a row or a column layout. Be very careful to not mix them and try to avoid that, especially at the beginner stage. Remember that white space helps a lot in sort of guiding your audience through your visualization. So instead of making a box about items that belong together, first give them some white space. And usually making an image or a chart a little bit smaller in order to gain white space on a page